Good evening, everybody. I was going to begin tonight by saying we meet at a time of upheaval and uncertainty. I wasn't expecting to acknowledge the death of Her Majesty the Queen. It's hard to overstate the importance of this long-serving, very dutiful monarch. It really is the end of an era. I was going to, though, mention the biggest conflict on the European continent since the Second World War, which is taking lives and wreaking destruction in Ukraine. This week, the Russian state-owned company Gazprom halted gas supplies into Europe along Nord Stream 1, which, of course, is the pipeline that goes to Germany. The Kremlin issued a stark warning that supplies wouldn't resume until Western sanctions against Russia ended. It was also the week when the United Kingdom installed a new Prime Minister. Liz Truss, the former Foreign Secretary and long-serving cabinet minister, was elected leader of the Conservative Party on Monday. Her predecessor, of course, Boris Johnson, was very forthright in his support for Ukraine, and he forged a very strong personal relationship with President Zelensky. I think he described President Putin's actions as evil. It seems likely that the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, will continue that stance. Writing in The Telegraph recently, she said, "Under my leadership, President Zelensky will have no greater ally at this dark hour than the UK." Well, it's those news stories that set the backdrop for this increasingly fraught and dangerous relationship between Russia and the West. I'm delighted to say, though, we have two speakers on the stage with us tonight who have plenty of first-hand experience of navigating that relationship, with mixed fortunes, I think it could be said, and will help us to understand things much more clearly. Mikhail Khodorkovsky is an exiled Russian businessman, formerly the head of Yukos, Russia's largest private oil company. He was widely believed to be the country's richest man before his arrest in 2003, when he was imprisoned for almost 10 years on charges of tax evasion and fraud, charges which he denied vigorously and defended. He now lives in exile and works to promote democracy and to strengthen civil society in Russia through his foundation, Open Russia. Mikhail is accompanied by his translator. Thank you very much in advance, Elena. Live translation is an extremely tough gig, and Elena does a fabulous job. And I'm also joined by Martin Sixsmith, journalist, writer, and former BBC correspondent in Moscow, Washington, Brussels, and Warsaw. He's the author of non-fiction titles, including Russia, the Wild East, and Putin's Oil and the Litvinenko File. Together, Martin and Mikhail are the co-authors of the new book, The Russia Conundrum: How the West Fell for Putin's Power Gambit and How to Fix It. Welcome to you all. Let's not beat about the bush and get stuck in. Mikhail, relations between Russia and the West are at rock bottom. If we think of the West as the US, NATO, and its allies, can they stop Putin?
Я всех приветствую. Сейчас существует много сомнений, в какую сторону будут развиваться события.
Greetings, everyone. There are lots of doubts at the moment how the events are going to pan out.
Но я лично абсолютно не сомневаюсь, что Путин начал эту войну на беду не только Украине, не только России, но и себе лично.
But I think this war that Putin embarked upon is not just the problem for Ukraine or for Russia, but for him as well, personally.
И эта война приближает его конец, и сыграет ли в этом основную роль Украина или придется большую роль играть НАТО, мы пока сказать не можем.
But this war is bringing his end closer. Whether it's going to be Ukraine that's going to bring this end closer or NATO, we don't know at the moment.
Но для Путина конец неизбежен.
But this end is inevitable.
How would you describe President Putin?
Это главная проблема, с которой я сталкиваюсь, разговаривая с западными политиками, западными лидерами.
This is the biggest problem I face when I talk to Western politicians and leaders.
Они все-таки пытаются воспринимать Путина как своего коллегу.
Because they still have this tendency to treat Putin as a colleague.
Как такого же, как они.
A man similar to them.
А это не так.
This is not the case.
Я часто им говорю, что если вы хотите разобраться с Путиным, понять его, то вам надо говорить не со специалистами из вашего Министерства иностранных дел,
So when I tell them that in order to understand Putin, they shouldn't really talk to experts from the Foreign Office.
вам надо прийти в какой-нибудь плохой район,
They should go to a crime-ridden area,
обратиться в полицейский участок,
to the local police station,
и любой комиссар полиции вам объяснит, что такое их обычный местный мафиози.
where any police inspector would tell them what a normal gangster mafiosi is like
И как с ним иметь дело.
and how you deal with them.
He's a gangster. Why are you so confident then that his end will come?
Sorry.
Why are you so confident that his end will come?
Почему вы так уверены, что наступит этот конец?
Путин, если вы посмотрите на путинскую историю, то это человек, который с 17 лет подрабатывал в Комитете государственной безопасности СССР.
Just look at Putin's history. From the age of 17, he has been working with or in the KGB.
Что такое Комитет государственной безопасности СССР?
And what was the KGB in the USSR?
Это организация, которая стояла вне закона.
It was an organization above the law.
Над ней был партийный контроль, но она не считала для себя закон чем-то важным.
Yes, there was party control, but that organization didn't think that law is anything to do with it.
Когда Путин вышел, закончил свою работу в КГБ, он пришел работать к тогдашнему мэру Санкт-Петербурга, господину Собчаку.
When Putin's term in the KGB was over, he went to work for the mayor of St. Petersburg at the time, Mr. Sobchak.
Надо сказать, что Санкт-Петербург в то время был приблизительно тем же для России, что Чикаго для Америки в 30-е годы. Это такой бандитский город.
St. Petersburg in Russia at the time was similar to Chicago in the 1930s, a gangster town.
И работа Путина была это установление взаимоотношений между бандитскими группировками Санкт-Петербурга и силовыми структурами Санкт-Петербурга, которые в то время не особенно отличались от бандитов.
And Putin's task was to establish relations between criminal gangs of St. Petersburg and also the law enforcement agencies of St. Petersburg, which at the time were not very much different from gangsters.
Он помогал им жить в союзе.
So he helped them to establish a kind of union.
После этого, перемещаясь в Кремль, он начал свою работу с того, что подставил проституток под тогдашнего генерального прокурора.
When he moved to the Kremlin, his first job, or the first thing he did, was to find some prostitutes to compromise the prosecutor general at the time.
Вот с таким человеком вы сейчас имеете дело. И
So
мы
this is the
все.
man you're dealing with at the moment, all of us are dealing with.
A fallible gangster, Martin. A bit of context then. How would you compare the current conflict with President Putin with the Cold War and with the Soviet Union? Are we talking about two very different things?
Well, there's a lot of parallels, and we had a period where we were very confident the Cold War was over. Very competent historian Robert Service wrote a book called The End of the Cold War. I suspect he may be revising it. The strange thing is the way that Moscow related to the West for all those years under Soviet communism was driven by ideology. The Cold War was the clash of political, social systems and beliefs. But now it seems much more driven by self-interest. So Putin's opposition to the West seems to stem from the personal hurt that he felt at the end of the Soviet Union, which he took really as a sort of personal humiliation.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that he's spent 20 years with that hurt festering inside him, and it's finally overflowed in February this year. But it's from within him and people like him. And it's very personal for Putin because it isn't an ideology-driven conflict, however much he pretends it is. It's very personal. And it's kind of financial as well, because he's a man who spent a long time enriching himself from state monies in Russia, money that should have been spent on roads and infrastructure and health service and pensions. And you can only do that for a certain length of time before people start to get upset with that. So if you're a dictator and you're worried that you're in the eye of the storm and people may be moving against you, what's the standard response? It's start a war, isn't it? So, if we look at the wars that he started, they all seem to have coincided with a plunge in his popularity rating. So 2008, he was very unpopular, so he invaded Georgia. 2014, again, his ratings were plummeting, and he moved into Crimea, annexed Crimea. And in the run-up to 2022, this year, what was happening, Navalny was coming back, discontent was, overflowing onto the streets. So what, again, is his response? It's, to start a war.
Interesting. Mikhail, if we go back then, you were a young man in your late 20s when the Soviet Union began to unravel and eventually collapse. Describe what it was like to live through that time.
Когда Советский Союз прекратил свое существование, мне было не так много лет.
I was quite young when the Soviet Union ceased to exist.
Надо сказать, что я, как и многие другие мои ровесники, в общем, не мог себе представить, что Советский Союз развалится.
In fact, like the rest of my peers, I couldn't imagine that the Soviet Union was going to collapse.
И когда в 1991 году я с моими друзьями выходил защищать наш российский Белый дом от тогдашнего мятежа,
And when back in 1991, together with my friends, I went to defend our Russian White House, the parliament, from the coup,
я защищал ту новую жизнь, ту новую экономику, которую нам предложил Горбачев, и в которой мы чувствовали себя нужными, востребованными.
We were defending this new life, this new economy that Gorbachev had brought about, where we would feel a role for ourselves in it.
Мы не думали, что в результате распадется Советский Союз.
We didn't realize that as a result of our actions, the Soviet Union was going to collapse.
Но сейчас, смотря назад, я вижу, что это была абсолютная неизбежность, заложенная за много лет до того, как мы вышли защищать Белый дом.
But now, looking back, I realize that it was inevitable, and in fact, it had started many years before that day when we went to defend the White House.
What in particular would you look back to? What events or changes really that began, if you like, the bricks coming out of the wall?
Когда вот эти кирпичики стали выпадать из советского фундамента, какие конкретные события?
Вот сейчас много обсуждается этот вопрос внутри России, потому что сегодняшняя война приводит к тому, что мы думаем о возможности распада России.
It's actually being hotly debated today because the war that's happening now is also another possibility for the fragmentation of Russia this time.
И на эту тему существует два представления.
And there are two ideas that exist as far as this particular topic is concerned.
Первое чисто экономическое. В 70-е годы у нас был такой премьер-министр Косыгин, который предложил постепенный переход к мягкому капитализму.
The first is purely economic. So we had Kosygin, who was the prime minister in the 1970s, and his idea was this soft transition to capitalism.
И это решение не было принято, но могло быть принято.
That decision wasn't made, wasn't adopted, but it could have been.
Но в этот момент открыли нефть Самотлора.
But at the time, the oil field of Samotlor was discovered in Russia.
И разговоры о том, что надо менять систему, прекратились.
And all talk about changing the system came to nothing.
Но это такое экономическое представление о причине развала Советского Союза. А есть представление более романтическое и, по-моему, более верное.
So this was the economic explanation of why the Soviet Union collapsed. But there is another, more romantic notion, and I think it's closer to the truth.
Советский Союз был страной одной идеи.
The Soviet Union was a country of one idea.
Мы, ну или точнее наши родители, наши дедушки и бабушки, думали, что мы можем показать миру новый путь развития.
Ourselves, or rather our parents and our grandparents, thought that they could show the world this new way forward.
И мир на самом деле не сразу усомнился, что это неправильный путь. В 20-е и в 30-е годы очень многие люди думали, что да, то, что строит Советский Союз, может быть, это как раз будущее человечества.
And doubts over this idea were not cast straight away by the world. In the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of people around the world thought that the Soviet Union could be that model for the rest of mankind, or the future of mankind.
Но 70 лет движения по этой идее показали, что это движение в тупик.
But 70 years of moving down that road showed that this was a dead end.
И когда эта идея исчерпала себя, то исчерпала себя и страна, которую эта идея скрепляла.
So when that idea came to nothing, the country that was symbolizing that idea also collapsed.
It was as simple as that. Martin, when you look back on that time, do you think there were signs? We can say now it was inevitable, but do you think, living in Russia at the end of the 80s, that you could see the signs that the collapse was on its way?
No, and anybody who said they could, I think, hindsight is a fantastic gift. But I was there through the end of the 80s, up to the coup that Mikhail was talking about, and it came out of the blue. I mean, obviously there were signs in terms of the Soviet republics agitating for independence from Moscow. Gorbachev sort of took the shackles off and granted the people the right of glasnost, the right to talk about things. He didn't want communism to collapse. He wanted to strengthen communism. He wanted to strengthen the Soviet Union. But he'd, in the sort of old cliches, he'd let the genie out of the bottle. Give the people an inch, they take a mile. And so there were signs. And at the beginning of 1991, I was in Riga when the fighting happened between the pro-independence and the pro-union forces. So there were signs that things were sort of crumbling. But that August 1991 came as a massive, massive surprise. And I think we kind of overreacted because, I look back at my reports for the BBC back then, and it was as if a sort of, a cloud had been lifted. Communism has gone, and now Russia will be like us. Russia will be a member of the international community of nations, respecting the same liberal political and economic values that we believe in. And looking back, I just realized how incredibly self-deluding I was.
It was a delusion that lasted for some time,
It did.
For at least a decade.
That's a really interesting thing. The 1990s, obviously, the Yeltsin years, but even into the Putin era. So for the first 4 or 5 years of Putin in power, people forget that he was at least paying lip service to the ideals of liberal democracy and greater integration into the world community and friendship with the West. And it does raise a very interesting question. Was he genuinely believing in those ideas, and then he's changed into this sort of swivel-eyed dictator in the years that happened afterwards, and therefore was the West partly at fault by not reciprocating his willingness to integrate into the world community, or more likely, was he mouthing these values and not believing in them? And Mikhail had first-hand experience of how Putin was able to convince people of things which were not necessarily true.
Hold that thought, because I definitely want to come back to it. It's really important. But I do want to just go back to the time of Yeltsin for a moment. This is the 1990s. Everything's changing. You made an awful lot of money under Yeltsin. I think you became an oligarch, right? What we talk about as oligarchs. You bought these share vouchers from ordinary people. There was these loans that you gave at one point to Yeltsin to prop up his government. But when you look back on that, we're critical now, I think, of oligarchs. People speak of them very badly, but you were part of that system. How do you reconcile that in your mind?
Когда началась новая экономика, а это был 1986 год, не так много людей, кто решился пойти в бизнес.
With the new economic trends, and they started in 1986, very few people actually decided to go into business, were brave enough to go into business.
А вы сами подумайте. С одной стороны, вы имеете закон о новых предприятиях, о новой экономике, где вы можете заниматься частным бизнесом.
Well, just think about it yourselves. On the one hand, there is this law about this new economy, new enterprises, where you could actually go into private business.
А с другой стороны, вы имеете уголовный закон, где написано, что занятие предпринимательством – это уголовное преступление, вы можете оказаться в тюрьме на много лет.
And at the same time, there is a criminal law where it says that if you actually work in business and are an entrepreneur, this is criminalized, it's a criminal offense, and you could actually end up being imprisoned for many years.
Мы с моими коллегами, приходя на работу на протяжении 5 лет, первых 5 лет, пока этот закон не был отменен, приветствовали друг друга. Привет, ты еще не в тюрьме?
For the first 5 years, my colleagues and I would go to work and actually greet ourselves, oh, you're still here, you're not in prison, until that actual law was abolished.
Поэтому не так много людей, кто пришел в бизнес.
So there were few people who decided to go into business.
Те, кто пришли, часть из них добились успеха.
Some of them, those who did go, became very successful.
А потом, 91 год, и нам говорят, что все, чего вы добились, у вас отнимут. Да, мы взяли в руки, так сказать, кто-то оружие, а кто-то кирпичи, и пришли защищать то, чего мы добились.
And then comes 1991 when we are told, aha, everything you've made is going to be expropriated from you. So then obviously we just some took weapons, others took bricks and went to defend what we had made.
А потом пришел 93 год, и опять нам сказали, мы отнимем все, что вы заработали. И мы опять взяли кто в руки оружие, кто кирпичи, и пошли опять защищать.
And then came 1993 when again we were told that no, you're going to give up everything that you have earned. Again we took up arms or bricks and went to defend what we had made.
Если кто-нибудь думает, что бизнес в ельцинские времена это были, так сказать, перелистывания страничек, это не так.
So if anyone here thinks that doing business under Yeltsin was just sort of reading, leafing through a book and nothing else, that wasn't the case at all.
Ни яхт, которые сейчас во множестве, так сказать, используются путинскими приближенными, ни дворцов, ничего этого в то время не было.
We had nothing like that, what Putin's cronies have today, yachts, palaces. There was nothing like that then.
Когда меня спрашивают, вот как я себе наиболее наглядным образом представляю свое тогдашнее состояние, богатство, я вам могу сказать, у меня прямо в глазах это стоит.
So when people ask me, so what was my wealth at the time? What was it like? How do I imagine it? I can actually tell you straight away.
Мы осваивали новое месторождение, Приобское месторождение в Западной Сибири.
We were actually developing the new oil field in Western Siberia, the Priokskaya field.
И от железнодорожной станции до этого месторождения по болотам было 180 километров.
And in order to reach that oil field from the railway station, you had to cross 180 kilometers over marshes, over bogland.
И мы отсыпали эту дорогу.
So we actually laid a road across the marshes.
И вот летишь на вертолете, а туда идут самосвалы с песком. И они идут один за одним, и все 180 километров самосвалы. Все 180 километров.
And just have this picture in your mind. So you're flying over it in a helicopter, and you have 180 kilometers worth of trucks, one after another, filled with sand and gravel.
Вот это для меня было, вот это богатство, вот я его так видел.
This is how I saw my wealth. This was my wealth.
Когда этот бизнес был отнят, мне, собственно говоря, эти деньги были не нужны.
But when my business was taken away from me, in fact, I didn't need the money.
Это деньги сами по себе, они не интересны. Вот самосвалы, мосты, тысячи работающих людей, тысячи огромных механизмов. Вот это интересно.
I wasn't really interested in money itself. What was interesting for me is those trucks, those bridges, thousands of people, thousands of huge machines working there. That was interesting.
You were daring, you were a risk taker. Martin, I'm going to bring you in here. Just briefly, it was a wild west, though, that 90s period. In order to survive, you needed to be made of stern stuff. I'm going to put it politely.
Yeah, I mean, it was capitalism red in tooth and claw. And I'm not sure the Russians really knew what capitalism was or what was going to happen. And in the West, the capitalist system has sort of developed a whole series of sort of safeguards that people act within certain parameters. In Russia, there was none of that. You know, business feuds were solved with a machine gun, and nobody had any sort of sense of where everything was going. And because there were no safeguards, the whole thing went dreadfully wrong by the end of the 1990s. And Yeltsin was complicit in that as well because of the corruption in the Kremlin. And I think that gave democracy a bad name, or Western-style capitalist democracy a bad name. So when Putin came to power in 2000, he was on a pretty sort of easy wicket because he was going to turn things around, go back to the old tried and trusted system and make the trains run on time.
And the public was open to that. I just quickly want to say, before we start talking about Putin, and it is a fascinating subject, that remember you will be able to ask questions very shortly, so do think about what you'd like to ask. We'll have mics in the hall. If you're watching online, you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button under the video screen, and then just press send, and we would like to hear from you all, and there will be plenty of time to do that. And also you can tweet us. Tweet about the event, or tweet us a question or a comment using the hashtag IQ2. So, to come to Putin then, you've made an awful lot of money, you've become the richest man in Russia. President Putin comes to power, you meet him. What did you think of him? How did you view him when you first met him?
Путин хоть и бандит, но человек очень талантливый.
Putin is a gangster, but he's a very talented gangster.
Он всегда покажет, если он хочет, он покажет тебе ровно то, что ты хочешь увидеть.
So he'll show you the face you want to see.
Вот президенту США Бушу-младшему он показал себя как чистой воды демократа.
So when he spoke to Bush Jr., he showed him a Democrat, a pure Democrat.
I think I've got the quote in front of me. He said, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul."
Так вот, я никогда на эту тему над Бушем не смеялся, потому что когда я разговаривал с Путиным, он мне показал себя современным, молодым, либеральным бюрократом, который, в отличие от уже пожилого Ельцина, может двигать нашу страну, нашу экономику дальше.
But I wouldn't ridicule Bush for that, because when I met Putin for the first time, he also appeared to me a young, liberal-minded, energetic bureaucrat who was going, unlike Yeltsin, to propel our country forward and its economy forward.
В России очень интересная есть лингвистическая особенность.
There is sort of a linguistic specificity in Russia.
Когда у нас говорят слово «государство», то у нас под этим понимают не вот узкобюрократический аппарат, а систему, которая вот эту вот самую вертикаль власти, вот эту вот пирамиду сверху донизу, вот это у нас понимают под словом «государство».
So when somebody says the state in Russia, they don't just mean the bureaucratic apparatus, they actually mean the whole system, a huge sort of vertically built system of the state.
А если мы хотим сказать про народ, про людей, про граждан, населяющих страну, мы говорим «страна».
But if we want to talk about the people themselves, the citizens of the country, we say the country.
Так вот, когда я встречался один раз из моих встреч с Путиным, мы говорили про одну вещь, которую я должен был сделать, ну или моя компания должна была сделать. И он мне сказал, что вот то, что вы должны сделать, это очень важно для государства.
So during one of my meetings with Putin, when we were discussing one of the objectives for my company, what I was supposed to be doing, he said, right, this you should be doing for the state. It's particularly important for the state.
Потом он себя остановил, говорит, нет, не для государства, это важно для страны.
And then he corrected himself and said, no, actually, it's not important for the state. It is important for the country.
И я подумал, вот современный человек, он понимает разницу между государством, вот этой вот бюрократией, вот этой вот машиной и страной, людьми, которые ее населяют.
So I actually thought, oh, what a modern thinking man. He actually understands the difference between the machine of the state and the people who live in the country.
Я бы хотел думать, что он просто изменился. Это значило бы, что я не ошибался в нем.
I would love to think that all that happened is that Putin actually changed. That would mean that I never made a mistake.
Но, увы, это не так.
Unfortunately, this is not the case.
В это же время он, выступая на коллегии ФСБ, сказал: первый шаг по проникновению в правительство выполнен.
Because at the very same time, when he was talking to the collegiate of the FSB, the Russian Secret Services, he actually said, I report that the first step of infiltrating the government has been fulfilled.
Об этом мы узнали позже.
Unfortunately, we only learned about it much later.
I mean, how powerful were you? You met him regularly at one point. Did you have a say? Do you think you had much influence?
Вы часто с ним встречались? Вы когда-нибудь чувствовали, что у вас есть какое-то влияние, что вы можете что-то такое сказать, что он примет во внимание?
Вы знаете, Путин, еще раз хочу подчеркнуть, он достаточно умный, достаточно в этом смысле опасный человек.
Yes, I would like to stress once again that Putin, in fact, is quite an intelligent and rather dangerous man.
Почему до сегодняшнего дня экономика России, в общем, в относительном порядке?
Because look at the economy of Russia, it is still quite okay.
Почему?
Why is that? Why is it coping?
Потому что экономикой продолжают заниматься, у нас их называют системные либералы.
Because people who are in charge of the Russian economy are the so-called systemic liberals.
Это Кудрин, это Набиуллина, это Греф и так далее.
People like Kudrin, Nabiullina, Gref and others.
И он их слушает, когда речь идет об вот непосредственно экономике.
And Putin actually listens to these people and their advice when they talk about the economy per se.
Но у них нет абсолютно никакого слова в вопросах политики или в вопросах, кому будет принадлежать то богатство, которое они помогают зарабатывать, ну или удерживать во всяком случае.
But they have absolutely no influence on Putin in terms of politics or on the decision how this wealth that they help, well, if not turn, but to retain, it's going to be divided, where it's going to go.
Поэтому да, я имел влияние на него в том, что касалось развития нефтяной промышленности, но не более того.
So, as far as I was concerned, yes, I had some impact. He would listen to me in terms of the development of the oil industry in Russia, but that was it.
Right. When did you realize that he wasn't perhaps the person you thought he was going to be? How quickly did the situation change?
В 2003 году мы почувствовали, что страна стоит на переломе.
We felt in 2003 that the country had come to an edge, to a sort of breaking point. There was going to be some kind of change.
С одной стороны, были люди, которые поддерживали наше стремление бизнеса к тому, чтобы экономика становилась более открытой и более прозрачной.
On the one hand, there were people who supported us, businessmen, for the economy to become more open, more transparent.
Мы хотели включаться в глобальные цепочки, создавать совместные компании. В частности, мы хотели создавать глобальную компанию с американцами.
For instance, we wanted to be part of the global supply chains. We wanted to create joint companies. Ourselves, we wanted to create a joint company with the Americans.
А с другой стороны, были люди, которые считали, что для них будет более выгодным, если страна будет закрытой, и если эта закрытая страна позволит им накапливать богатство в процессе коррупции.
On the other hand, there were those who thought it would be better for them if the country was a closed country, because that would allow them to accumulate wealth as part of their corruption.
Это были несовместимые интересы.
These interests were incompatible.
И мы решили побороться за то решение, которое будет принимать Путин.
So we decided to fight for the decision that Putin was about to make.
Когда я говорю «мы», это Российский союз промышленников и предпринимателей, это часть администрации президента, включая, между прочим, тогдашнего заместителя главы администрации президента господина Медведева.
When I say we, who is we? It's actually the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, but also part of the presidential office, including the deputy head of that office at the time, Mr. Medvedev.
Когда читаешь сегодняшние его твиты, в это поверить не можешь.
If you read Medvedev's tweets today, you would never believe that that was the man. He was the same man.
Но, тем не менее, это тот же человек.
Nevertheless, it is the same man.
Я был выбран тем человеком, который должен был сделать этот самый доклад о коррупции.
So I was selected as the person who was going to make that report about corruption.
Почему? Ну, потому что настоящих буйных мало.
Well, why was I chosen? Well, because very few people are actually ready to do something like that, are crazy enough to do something like that.
Мое выступление до сих пор можно посмотреть в YouTube.
And you can actually watch my report on YouTube still. It's there.
Я привел один из примеров, когда из государственной компании было очевидно, наглядно украдено $400 миллионов.
I had used one of the examples when a state company lost $400 million in a very blatant way. They were just embezzled from that company.
Когда я делал этот доклад, стало видно, что Путин уже принял решение, и оно не на нашей стороне.
So, as I was making that report, it became clear to me that Putin had already taken a decision, and that decision was not to go the way we wanted.
Стало понятно, пускай несколько позже, что он хотел сделать коррупцию тем инструментом, с помощью которого он сможет управлять государственным аппаратом.
What became evident is that he had already decided to make corruption into a tool that would allow him to manage the state machine, the state apparatus.
Это вот как ситуация, как устроена в банде. Пока ты с ними, ты должен совершать преступления, но ты пользуешься всеми богатствами.
It's the same law that reigns in a criminal gang. While you're part of that criminal gang, you have to commit crimes, as the gang decides. But then you can share, you can use all the wealth, all the riches of the gang.
Если ты не совершаешь преступления, значит, ты не с нами.
But if you don't commit the crimes, you're not one of us, you're not part of us.
К слову, эти 400 миллионов, как потом оказалось, были положены в его карман.
In fact, as it turned out, the 400 million that I was talking about lined Putin's pockets personally.
Я это узнал спустя 7 лет.
I learned that fact 7 years later.
So by 7 years later, you were in prison. You spent 10 years in prison for opposing Putin. Others became silent. You carried on opposing him. How did that experience of imprisonment change you?
Когда проводишь 10 лет в тюрьме, то на выходе меняются некий набор ценностей.
Well, basically, when you spend 10 years in prison, when you're released, your value system has changed.
И, в частности, мне очень трудно относиться так же серьезно к бизнесу, как раньше.
For instance, for me, my take on business has changed. It's difficult for me to take it seriously anymore.
Ты это воспринимаешь несколько в большей степени как игру, потому что ты знаешь, что в жизни очень много вещей, которые стоят дороже.
Because now I look at it more as a game, because I realize that there are lots of things in life which are much more valuable.
Life would seem to be one of them. Martin, just thinking back then, thinking about what Mikhail's described, thinking about where we've arrived now, how do you explain the naivety of the West in its assessment of President Putin?
I think it was sort of the triumph of hope over actual observation. And I remember at the end of 1991 when George Bush Sr. made his New Year address to the American people, it was like a sort of baseball coach who'd won the World Series, because his whole take on the collapse of the Soviet Union was that we did it. You know, we Americans have stood up to this dreadful communist system for 70 years, but now it's gone. It's a triumph for American values. And it wasn't. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union came from within the Soviet Union. And I think that sort of mentality that now communism has gone, we can forget about Russia, was the way that the West approached Russia for the next 10 years at least, and probably more, that we've solved that problem. We don't need to worry about it anymore. But they'd forgotten that the victors are on a pretty sticky wicket if they start preaching to the vanquished, and the Americans did that, and a lot of people in the West did that, politicians in the West did that. And I don't know whether it was naivety or it was just sort of blind faith that, you know, Russia would change and become something it hadn't been for 1,000 years. I don't want to say that, you know, the reason Putin is now so anti-Western is the fault of the West, because it's the fault of Putin and it's the fault of the people around Putin. But the West maybe didn't help in the way that it treated Putin and people like him after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mikhail, when you think about the current situation, the war in Ukraine, there are those, even now in the West, we've certainly heard ideas like this from France and Germany, who talk about compromise, about a negotiated outcome with Putin. We've heard that a lot since February. What do you say? Is it possible, in your view, to have a negotiated settlement as things stand?
Любая война заканчивается соглашением.
Well, any war ends in an agreement.
И в данном случае его тоже не избежать.
So it's unavoidable in this case as well.
Весь вопрос заключается в том, в какой момент ты можешь заключить соглашение.
The question is when to strike such an agreement.
Indeed. If we did it now, if there was a negotiation now.
К сожалению, с таким человеком, как Путин, вы не можете заключить соглашение в тот момент, когда он считает, что он сильнее.
Unfortunately, you cannot strike an agreement with a person like Putin when he feels that he has the upper hand.
Он может вас обмануть, если вам надо.
He can actually deceive you if
you want.
necessary, if you want. Yeah.
Но это не будет соглашение.
But this agreement is not going to be a real agreement.
Мне здесь часто приводят в качестве примера его слова в отношении загнанной в угол крысы.
People often use this example of Putin's words about a cornered rat.
Мол, не загоняйте Путина в угол, потому что он станет опасен.
People say, don't corner Putin, because if he has his back against the wall, he's going to be dangerous.
Всегда есть разница между тем, чтобы не загонять крысу в угол, и тем, чтобы дать крысе пить твою кровь.
But there is a difference between cornering a rat and allowing this rat to drink your blood.
В тот момент, когда крыса загнана в угол, и она понимает, что все, что она может сделать, это сбежать в свою черную нору и там затаиться, в этот момент, может быть, ее стоит отпустить.
Perhaps it's okay releasing the rat at the moment when it feels that it has nothing else but flee to its hole and keep quiet there. That is the moment when you can let it go.
Но в тот момент, когда крыса еще считает, что она побеждает, пытаться с ней договориться, это значит ждать, что она позовет своих товарок для того, чтобы они загрызли вас уже до смерти.
But trying to negotiate with the rat when it feels that it's having the upper hand means that actually this rat is going to call all the rest of its allies, other rats, and really finish you off.
Поэтому, увы, я должен согласиться со словами господина Борреля, удивительными для европейского бюрократа. Этот вопрос будет решаться на поле боя, а не за столом переговоров.
So unfortunately, I would have to agree with Josep Borrell, the arch-European bureaucrat, who said that this particular problem is going to be resolved on the battlefield, not at the negotiations table.
Does that suggest that you believe there might be at some point regime change?
Проигрыш Путина в этой войне с высокой степенью вероятности дестабилизирует его режим.
I think there is a high likelihood that Putin's defeat in this war is going to destabilize his regime.
Удастся ли его сменить или не удастся, это зависит от многих обстоятельств, это зависит от россиян.
The success of the regime change, however, depends on many different circumstances, including on the Russians themselves.
И еще более важно, когда этот режим сменится, все равно он рано или поздно сменится, куда дальше пойдет Россия?
And the more important question, when the regime is actually changed, when there is a regime change, and inevitably there will be a regime change, is the way and the direction Russia is going to take after that.
И именно поэтому я и мои коллеги так настоятельно убеждаем Запад не выстраивать железный занавес.
And this is why my colleagues and I are repeating to the West, please don't build another iron curtain.
Потому что режим уйдет, а Россия-то останется.
Because the regime change is going to happen, but Russia is going to be there still, it will remain.
И Россия может быть частью решения проблем, которые стоят сейчас перед миром, а не той проблемой, которая она сейчас является при режиме Путина.
And Russia could become part of the solution, not part of the problem that we have today for the world under Putin.
I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure there's enough time for questions from the audience, but one last one from me, which is the West is currently supplying arms to Ukraine. It's imposed sanctions on Russia. It's debatable how well those sanctions are working, but nonetheless they're in place. What more could or should it do?
Что еще может сегодня сделать Запад?
Во-первых, я бы очень хотел, чтобы Запад, принимая решения о России, вовлекал в эти решения профессионалов, а не только политиков.
What would be really good if the West, when taking decisions vis-à-vis Russia, involved professionals in those decisions, not just politicians.
Я когда слушаю те идеи, которые двигаются в отношении санкций, особенно на энергетическом рынке, в котором я разбираюсь, мне просто за голову хочется схватиться.
Sometimes I want to cry when I hear some of the ideas mooted around, particularly about the energy sanctions, because I do have some knowledge about the energy markets.
И то, что сейчас делается в отношении идей с ограничениями цены, это, вот поверьте мне, это бред.
For instance, the price cap, one of the ideas that's being hotly debated at the moment, this is nonsense, believe me.
Есть другие механизмы, я не буду сейчас отнимать ваше время для того, чтобы о них говорить, но специалистов хоть послушайте.
There are other mechanisms. I'm not going to waste your time discussing them now, but look, listen to professionals, please.
20 лет назад, когда принимали решения об энергетической политике Запада, вот эти решения сегодня превратились вот в те чеки на оплату коммунальных услуг, которые вы получаете.
Because those decisions that were taken 20 years ago about the energy policies of the Western countries are in fact today giving you the results that you see, the huge utility bills you have to pay.
Это результат непрофессиональных не политических решений, а непрофессиональных именно в понимании специалистов по энергетике.
I think this is the result of unprofessional decisions being made, not political decisions, but by people who specialize in energy.
К сожалению, то, что я слышу сейчас, одновременно слышны и абсолютно здравые идеи, и параллельно я слышу какой-то абсолютный бред. И я не могу понять, потому что я знаю, что прекрасных специалистов вот здесь вот, даже в Великобритании, огромное количество.
Today we hear all kinds of ideas. Some of them are very sensible, others are total nonsense. And I cannot understand why this nonsense is being listened to, because there are lots of really excellent experts even here in the UK.
Я не могу этого понять.
So still not clear to me why this is happening.
Но на ответ на вопрос, что можно сделать, ответ очень простой.
And in fact, the answer of what can be done or should be done now is quite simple.
Оружие.
Weapons.
Оружие, поставленное в Украину, на сегодняшний день чуть больше, чем на 10 миллиардов долларов.
I think the weapons supplied to Ukraine, that have been supplied to Ukraine so far, are probably worth $10 billion.
Это ничего по сравнению с теми потерями в сфере энергетики, которые вот сейчас будут доставаться из ваших карманов.
Which is nothing compared with those losses in the energy field, which is going to happen, that are going to happen now, and you have to pay out of your pocket.
Если бы этого оружия было не на 10 миллиардов, а на 50, сейчас бы ситуация на фронте была бы вообще другой.
Had the supplies been not tens of billions of dollars, but $50 billion or more, the situation on the front would have been completely different now.
И я вас уверяю, понимая господина Путина, я вас уверяю, что сегодня вот то, что он творит с энергетическим шантажом, он бы побоялся творить.
And knowing Putin and understanding what he's trying to do, I know full well that he would not dare blackmailing Europe with his energy like he's doing today.
Well, there's a very clear answer there. I'm going to take that moment to open up to questions from all of you. The light's going to come up. I think we're going to have some microphones at the front, and I've just lost my earpiece. Or are we going to have a roving mic? Yes, we've got a roving mic. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one from over there, one from here in the front, and one from over there. So it's 3, but hang on just a second. I'm just going to say, please keep your questions brief. We'll try and get as many of them in as we can, and there are a few online as well. So let's take 3 to begin with, and then we'll get going.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khodorkovsky and Mr. Sixsmith, and your interpreter as well, for a marvelous presentation. Could you please say, Putin is not the only Russian nationalist. He's not the only Russian imperialist. So when you say regime change, you give no idea of what will come after Putin, which could just be another Russian nationalist or another Russian imperialist. Do you think there is any serious chance of achieving your object and creating an open Russia? Your organization is called Open Russia, which means a westernized, liberal, democratic Russia, which a lot of Russians won't like. So do you think there is any serious prospect of a democratic, liberal Russia?
All right, lovely. There's another question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed, and also you spoke very well at the Financial Times Festival on Saturday. I was going to ask the same question, but I'll ask a different one. A lot of Putin's economic power will largely depend on the response of China, supplying oil to the East. Do you have any comment on that in terms of, because that could make or break the regime a lot faster than what we are doing in the West?
Okay, lovely. And one more here.
Hi. You mentioned Putin's gangsterism and governance for his self-enrichment. How would you answer the charge of being a member of the kleptocracy, the oligarchy which strangled Russia's economy post-91? And is your opposition to Putin merely a reflection of an economic vendetta against Putin, or motivated by a genuine idealism for the future of Russia? In short, are you a liberal or an opportunist?
Okay, I'll quickly run through those again. So what will be potentially after regime change? Is it about creating an open Russia, or will there simply be another nationalist who takes charge? What's the role of China in the future of Russia? And I think the rather nice summing up there, are you an opportunist or what was your second word? Idealist, that's it, I can't read my own writing. Over to you, Mikhail, you can take those in turn.
Верю ли я в возможность открытой демократической России? Да, конечно. Если бы я не верил, я бы не занимался Россией сейчас.
Do I believe in an open democratic Russia? Yes, I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be dealing with it and trying to achieve it and bring it forward now.
Я вижу реально одну проблему. И российские граждане, и Запад находятся в парадигме доброго царя.
But I do see one problem, because both the West and Russian citizens are still reliving the paradigm of a good Tsar.
Вот сейчас плохой царь, а мы найдем хорошего.
Now we have this bad Tsar, but we will find a different one, a good one.
И ничего не получится.
This is not going to succeed.
Сверхцентрализованная Россия нуждается во внешнем враге.
An overly centralized Russia would always need an external enemy.
Потому что это единственное объяснение для того, чтобы поддерживать сверхцентрализацию.
Because this is the only way and the only explanation that would allow you to keep it so super centralized.
Если нам удастся федерализовать Россию, то есть сделать Россию реальной федерацией, изменения будут.
But if we succeed in turning Russia into a real federation, federalizing it properly, then the changes will follow.
И я верю, что это возможно, потому что я вижу, как регионы становятся политическими субъектами.
And I do think this is possible because I can see that the regions of Russia are becoming more and more politically autonomous, more and more independent politically.
Not political subjects.
Okay.
И я считаю, что этому надо помочь. Вот над этим надо сейчас работать.
And I think this is something we should be working on now, and this is something we should help.
Что касается Китая и поставок туда нефти, не переоценивайте влияние энергетического рынка на экономику России.
And your question about the supplies of oil to China, we shouldn't overestimate the influence of that on the economy of Russia.
У России огромный внутренний рынок.
Because Russia has got its huge domestic market.
И весь энергетический экспорт составляет порядка 10% валового внутреннего продукта.
The export of energy is only about 10% of its GDP.
Да, он составляет существенную часть от федерального бюджета.
Yes, it's true that that is quite a considerable chunk of the federal budget.
Но от валового внутреннего продукта совсем небольшая часть.
But from the internal domestic product, it's only a very small part.
И здесь скорее важны те технологические санкции, которые сейчас наложены на Россию.
But I think what is important are the technology sanctions which have been imposed on Russia.
Важнее то, что образованные молодые люди сейчас покидают Россию.
Plus the young, educated people leaving Russia at the moment.
Это подрывает технологические возможности режима продолжать агрессию.
Because both these two things undermine the technological capability of the regime to continue with its aggression.
Но, конечно, это имеет влияние только в среднесрочной перспективе.
But this only makes sense in the mid-term.
Сегодня вопрос решает только одно – оружие.
But short-term, the only solution is weapons, supplying weapons.
И больше ничего. Ну и, наконец, то, что касается меня как личности. Я не готов говорить о том, что я такой замечательный человек. Я не самый замечательный человек.
So your last question, the last question was about me personally. I am not going to claim that I'm the best or most wonderful person in the world. No.
Я действительно не сильно люблю Путина.
Right, I do not look like Putin. That's true.
Но я несколько раз в моей жизни выходил для того, чтобы защищать и свое достояние, и демократию.
But there have been several moments in life when I went to defend both my own wealth and democracy.
Я выходил с голыми руками против оружия.
Barehanded against weapons.
И потом от меня это потребовалось еще один раз в 2003 году.
And then another moment came in 2003 again.
У меня все было хорошо.
I was doing fine, believe me.
И я мог продолжать жить так же хорошо.
And I could have coasted on in the same way, very comfortably.
Но я верил, что моя страна может стать лучше.
But I had that firm belief that my country could be made better.
Я вышел еще раз, и я проиграл. Я за это заплатил 10 годами своей жизни.
So I went and spoke out, and I lost, and I paid with 10 years of my life.
Сейчас я на свободе, и я продолжаю драться.
And now, you know, I'm here, I'm free, and I continue fighting.
Martin, if I can bring you
I
in.
just add something?
Yeah.
I think... Could I just add something? I think the charge of being an opportunist would be absolutely justified if he had only started to enunciate his opposition to Putin after he'd fallen out with Putin. But he was already doing it back in 2000, 2003, he was standing up for the values of liberal democracy and freedom, and that was what got him in trouble with Putin. His big confrontation with Putin was in February 2003. He was arrested in October, and between February and October, he was endlessly being warned by people in the Kremlin that you need to get out now. So he had those months where he said to the other people in Yukos, you don't need to be part of this. You go if you want to go. But he didn't. He took a conscious decision to stay in Russia, knowing that he would be on the receiving end of some rough justice from Putin. He may not have known that he was going to spend 10 years in a prison, but he knew he was going to go to jail. So he had that opportunity to get out. He could have taken enough money with him to have a very nice lifestyle in the West, but he didn't. He stayed, and the reason he stayed was because he genuinely believed in the values that he was fighting for. So I think there is a certain amount of idealism in doing that, and he certainly paid for it. So the charge of opportunism, I don't think is a fair one. I mean, I can see why you asked the question, but I really don't think it's fair to say that. So if I had to say idealist or opportunist, I'd say idealist.
Adrian, who's online, asks, are you worried for your own safety by speaking out against Putin?
Вы боитесь за свою жизнь, говоря вот так вот?
Знаете, меня каждый раз об этом спрашивают.
Do you know, this is the question I'm always asked every time.
Вот мне интересно, если у вас кто-нибудь из знакомых военный пилот, вы его каждый раз спрашиваете, слушай, ты боишься сегодня идти на работу?
Maybe one of you knows someone who is a fighter pilot. Do you actually ask them every time, are you afraid to fly that plane today?
Кто-то из вас, возможно, лично знаком с монтажниками, которые работают на огромной высоте.
Or perhaps some of you know people who work at huge heights.
Вы их спрашиваете каждый день, слушай, ты боишься идти на свою работу?
Do you also ask them, aren't you afraid going out and climbing that height every day of your life?
Я, к слову, работал монтажником.
And actually, I was one of the people who worked at heights, you know, assembling things.
Иногда действительно забывал пристегнуть карабин.
And sometimes I even forgot to put the safety harness on me.
И когда ты замечаешь, что ты его не пристегнул, и у тебя так пот по тебе стекает.
And when you suddenly realize, oh my God, there is no safety harness there, you start sweating profusely.
Ты думаешь, да, наверное, можно было бы найти и получше работу.
And you start thinking, perhaps I chose the wrong job.
Тем не менее, каждый из нас занимается своим делом, и просто ты каждый день не думаешь о том, что это опасно.
Nevertheless, each of us does their own job, and you don't really think on a daily basis how risky that job is.
Martin, I just want to come back to the question about China. It is interesting. President Xi and President Putin have signed a memorandum of understanding. They've very publicly declared that they're going to make their relationship stronger. There's speculation, or perhaps it's more than that, I'm not sure, that President Xi's sort of first visit abroad for some time will be to Kazakhstan to meet President Putin. Is that an important relationship going forward beyond the sort of economics that Mikhail was describing?
It's always been a three-way dynamic, haven't you? You know, you go back to the days of Nixon and Kissinger, and China was always the sort of wild card that was played in that Cold War scenario, and I think China is very good at exploiting that card. Economically, it's a great opportunity for China because Russia is losing clients in the West, so China sees an opportunity to clean up economically, but politically, China has a very clear opportunity to become a world player, a much more important world player than it already is. We'll have to see how it goes between Xi and Putin, because there's a lot of rhetoric in these games, which is, is little more than rhetoric.
One more question online, and then I'll come back to you in the hall. Claire asks, do you think Putin has ambitions to escalate the war in Ukraine with countries in the Balkans?
Собирается ли он пойти на Балканы, то есть в планах вход, эскалация войны на Украине?
Я убежден, что если бы Украина не оказалась настолько твердым орешком, сегодня у Путина точно были бы планы восстанавливать Советский Союз за пределами Украины.
I think had Ukraine not proved to be such a tough nut to crack for Putin, Putin would now build plans to go beyond Ukraine and build Soviet Union beyond Ukraine.
Но украинцы сейчас иногда говорят, и они говорят правду, что они защищают не только свою свободу.
And when the Ukrainians tell us today that they are fighting not just for their freedom alone, they are right.
Это правда.
This is the truth.
All right, 3 more in the hall. Okay, there's. I'm going to take a couple over there and 1 at the back. And if I can get some more in, if you're quick, then maybe we can get some more in. Go on, go for it.
Hi, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask about, and you mentioned it, the sort of brain drain from Russia, and what you thought of policies now introduced by various European states, especially in the Baltics, banning Russian student visas. Do you think that that sort of policy is what's needed to drain Putin's economy, or is it so harmful to the long-term future of an open Russia that you'd be opposed to it?
Okay, and another one. There was a chap at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear your take on how Putin gets input on different decisions he makes. You were talking about the economy, for example. And I'd love to hear your view on whether he sought any input before invading Ukraine,
Okay.
or whether that was a decision on his own.
All right, and there's one right at the back over there.
Good evening. I'm a Ukrainian refugee. I live in London now. I am here because of the war. And my question to Mikhail is, how can you explain the very huge percentage of support for Putin from Russian people? Please don't speak about Moscow citizens and diaspora. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 questions there. Could the brain drain actually be a way to weaken Russia, to bring Putin down? Was the decision to invade Ukraine Putin's alone? And how do you explain the Russian support for the war in Ukraine?
Утечка мозгов серьезно ослабляет режим.
The brain drain is really weakening the regime.
Я приведу вам только один пример.
Just one example.
Путин хотел отключить Россию от YouTube, но из внутриполитических соображений нужно было чем-то тогда его заменить.
So Putin wanted to block the YouTube in Russia, but because of the domestic reasons, he needed to replace YouTube with something else.
И они сделали такую систему, как RooTube.
So they created the RooTube instead of the YouTube.
И, в общем, она развивалась, и мы с ужасом ждали, когда она будет запущена.
So it had been developing for some time, and we were terrified to wait for the moment when it was going to be launched.
Потом начался вот этот отток специалистов, уехало 30 тысяч специалистов в области IT.
And then the 30,000 IT experts left Russia after the beginning of the war.
И RooTube рухнул.
And RooTube just collapsed.
Вы можете заметить, насколько меньше сейчас говорят про русских хакеров.
Have you noticed that they speak less and less about Russian hackers today?
Они уехали.
They have all left Russia.
The decision to invade Ukraine, was it Putin's alone?
Что касается решения атаковать Украину, то у Путина действительно было убеждение, что на Украине его встретят цветами.
So as for the decision to go into Ukraine, Putin really did think that they were going to accept or to meet him with open arms, with flowers.
Отмечу, сегодня он имеет гораздо лучшее представление о том, что происходит в Украине, но почему это впечатление было настолько ошибочным?
Mind you, today his idea of what's happening in Ukraine is much better. But why did he have that erroneous idea in the first place?
COVID.
COVID. A simple answer.
Он находился в своем бункере, и очень было сокращено количество людей, с которыми он общался.
He was sitting in his bunker with a very, very small number of people he would communicate with.
И один из этих людей, господин Юрий Ковальчук.
One of these people was Yuri Kovalchuk.
К слову, его отец родом из украинского города Николаева.
Whose father actually comes from Nikolaev in Ukraine.
Идеи Путина на эту тему во многом, ну, если не рождены, то поддержаны господином Ковальчуком.
So Mr. Kovalchuk was perhaps not the author necessarily of the intervention in Ukraine, but at least a supporter of that idea, very much so.
Ну и, наконец, почему такая поддержка войны?
And finally, the last question about the support for the war in Russia.
Ну, во-первых, я бы все-таки на вашем месте не настолько верил результатам вот этих вот социологических опросов.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't really believe all the opinion polls we hear about and their results.
Я много разговаривал с профессиональными социологами, и все они мне сказали, что социологические опросы при диктатуре во время войны вообще ни о чем не свидетельствуют.
A lot of sociologists have told me that the results of a sociological survey under a dictatorship during a war are not really a witness or a testimony of anything.
Вот здесь один из этих социологов сидит, можете с ним потом пообщаться.
One of those sociologists are actually present here, so you can have a chat with them later.
Когда идет опрос, обычно в обычном состоянии отвечают 2 человека из 10, которым подходят опросчики.
In a normal situation, out of 10 people being surveyed, 2 would give answers, would actually respond.
И обычно эти 2 в достаточной степени представляют то же мнение, что оставшиеся 8.
And those 2, in fact, represent the opinion of the remaining 8, more or less.
Теперь представьте себе, диктатура, война. К вам подходит человек, задает вопрос, вы за войну или против?
And now imagine that you are living in a dictatorship and there is war going on. Somebody approaches you in the street and says, are you pro-war or against it?
И у вас есть возможность не ответить.
Well, one choice you have is just not to reply.
О чем свидетельствуют ответы оставшихся 2?
So the remaining 2 who do reply, what is this testimony of?
Это то, что эти 2 были агенты ФСБ.
They are FSB agents, that's what.
Ну а если говорить серьезно, то, конечно, вот это вот воспоминание об империи, оно, конечно, сказывается.
But seriously speaking, this nostalgia about for the empire is having a role in it, definitely.
Именно поэтому поддержка войны настолько велика в сегменте 55+, и настолько мала в сегменте 30-.
This is why the people 55 and older support it much more than people 30 and younger.
И это дает нам надежду.
And this gives us hope.
Interesting. All right, I'm going to take 2 more and then we're out of time, I'm afraid. Okay, I'm going to go right to the back there because I think you guys haven't had a fair shout.
Just very quickly, Alexei Navalny, is he a good man? And how come he's still alive?
Okay, and there was one hand that went up. Okay, I'm going to go with this guy there. There's just a chap there. Yeah, a little bit. There you go.
Hi. What, if anything, gives you hope?
Okay, so is Navalny a good guy, and what brings you hope?
Навальный сегодня это политзаключенный, и поэтому я его поддерживаю вне зависимости от того, насколько совпадают или расходятся наши взгляды.
Today, Navalny is a political prisoner, so I would support him irrespective of whether our views and ideas coincide or not.
Единственное, от чего я хочу предостеречь всех, по крайней мере, своих сограждан, но и западных лидеров. Не ищите доброго царя. Добрых царей в России не бывает.
The only thing I would like to warn all Russian citizens and people in the West against is not to look for a kind Tsar. There would never be a kind Tsar in Russia.
А Горбачев попытался быть хорошим царем. Сколько он им остался? 1 год.
So Gorbachev tried to be this good Tsar in Russia. How long did he last? 1 year.
But do you think Alexei Navalny wants to be a good Tsar?
А что, Навальный хочет быть таким хорошим царем?
Еще раз. Мы все, я уверен, что и Путин хотел быть хорошим царем. И все хотят быть хорошими, никто не хочет быть плохими.
Well, the thing is that nobody wants to be a bad Tsar. Everybody intends to be a good one,
Well.
including Putin when he started.
But a Tsar as opposed to a democrat?
Если мы хотим свободную, демократическую, неагрессивную Россию, она должна быть парламентской республикой и глубоко федеративной парламентской республикой.
I think if you want to see a free, liberal, democratic Russia, which is not an aggressive country, it has to be a parliamentary republic and deeply federal.
Я вам сейчас постараюсь рассказать анекдот. Это трудно, но мы постараемся.
So we're going to try a joke. It's difficult, but we'll try.
У нас есть завод в России, который производит ужасные автомашины.
There is a factory in Russia which makes really bad cars.
Тольятти.
Tolyatti.
И вот стоят главный инженер и директор этого завода и смотрят вниз.
So imagine a chief engineer and a director of the Tolyatti factory standing there looking down,
На завод.
looking over the factory.
И говорят, оборудование меняли, ничего не получилось.
They're saying, we've tried to change all the equipment, but it didn't work.
Модели машин меняли, ничего не получилось.
We've tried to change the models that we're making here in the factory. Didn't work.
Что делать-то?
What should we do?
Главный инженер говорит, я тебе говорил, место проклятое.
The chief engineer says, this is a God-forsaken place. This is, I told you.
Вот место царя в России, оно проклятое.
So the place of a Tsar in Russia, it's God-forsaken, it's cursed.
Когда туда приходит хороший человек, он спустя короткое время становится плохим.
Even a good person sitting in that chair sometime later becomes a bad person.
Interesting. Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
I just wanted to tell an anecdote, a joke, in connection with why so many people in Russia seem to support this dreadful war in Ukraine and how people think about what they say about their attitudes. And my favorite joke is about the 2 FSB men who at the end of a very long day are having a drink in the FSB canteen in Moscow. And Dmitry says to Ivan, he says, Ivan, tell me, what do you really think about this Putin regime that we live under? And Ivan says, the same as you do. And Dmitry says, in that case, it's my duty to arrest you.
We are really out of time, but I am going to ask you, that's a wonderful kind of end thought, to answer that last question, which was, what gives you hope, Mikhail?
А я же сказал, те, кому сейчас нет 30, они не помнят ту страну, которую помним мы.
Well, I've already answered this question partly when I said that those under 30 do not remember the country we remember.
Путин умрет, и мое поколение тоже уйдет, хотя я моложе Путина на 11 лет.
Putin is going to die, and my generation is going to leave the stage as well, although I'm younger than Putin by 11 years.
Я вот был в Германии и разговаривал там с людьми и спрашивал, а вот когда у вас реально прошел отказ от нацизма?
When I spoke to people in Germany, I asked them, when did people forgo Nazism really in the end? When did they get rid of it in themselves?
И они мне все в один голос ответили, Где-то, говорит, в 68-м.
And they all spoke and said as one man, about 1968.
Поколение ушло.
It took a generation change.
Вот то, на что я надеюсь на новое поколение.
So this is my hope, the new generation.
Well, an amazing thought to end on. Thank you very much to Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Martin Sixsmith. I'm just going to add, thank you all for your questions. They were fantastic, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. But both Mikhail and Martin will be signing books. So do go along and get your copy of the book. It's a great read. But thank you all very much for coming.